Did you know there's an island somewhere in the world where all the birds have evolved to not be able to fly? And it's not even like some weird, prehistoric, unknown island. It's actually just off the coast of New Zealand. This is Stewart Island, also known as Rakiura, and it's home to around 4,000 people and more than 500 species of native plants and animals. Most of these can also be found on the mainland of New Zealand, except for one group, the birds. The birds of Stewart Island are bizarre because none of them can fly. They've all become flightless. This includes the ancestors of kiwis, which are normally flightless themselves, but they still retain their ability to fly over from the mainland. And yet somehow the birds on this island have evolved to not be able to fly, even though they could. And they're not stupid flightless birds either. This isn't anything like the dodo bird situation where evolution took something away from them that they never really needed. These birds would definitely benefit from being able to fly. But how did this happen? How did an entire population of birds evolve to not be able to fly when they live on an island that's literally just off the coast of another one? Well, let's start with the specifics of the island itself. As islands go, Stewart Island is pretty big. It's around 1,700 square kilometers, about two-thirds the size of Los Angeles. So it's not so small that we might assume that the birds just evolved to not need to fly because there wasn't enough space. It's also not so far away from the mainland that we might think the birds evolved to not need to fly because they couldn't get over there anymore. In fact, Stewart Island is only 35 kilometers from the South Island of New Zealand, with the two being connected by a narrow stretch of water called Fovo Strait. So why wouldn't these birds just fly over there? Well, we can thank the ancestors of the kiwi for that. You see, back in the day, the ancestors of kiwis used to fly over from the mainland of New Zealand to Stewart Island quite regularly, and the birds that made the journey were generally the strongest flyers, the ones who didn't have to stop and rest halfway across the strait. So while most of the birds that attempted this journey died, the ones that made it over lived. And since they were stronger flyers, they were better at finding food and thus more likely to breed and pass on their strong genes. This slowly evolved into a population of birds that were better and better at flying long distances, until eventually, after hundreds or thousands of years, they no longer needed to fly over from the mainland. They simply did. But this meant that any birds that flew over from the mainland to Stewart Island were generally weaker flyers, the ones who had to stop and rest halfway across the strait. And these weaker birds were less likely to find food and thus less likely to breed. This created a situation where the birds on Stewart Island were generally worse at flying than the birds on the mainland, even though the two groups had originally been the same. And the difference has only gotten more pronounced since then. After all, the birds on the mainland still have to fly there every now and then, whereas the birds on the island don't have to fly at all. So the birds on Stewart Island have evolved to not fly, not because they don't need to, but because they're actually worse at flying. They're stuck on an evolutionary treadmill where they're getting worse and worse at flying, even though they're not actually benefiting from not flying. That's why when conservationists tried to introduce a non-native species of flightless bird to the island, the birds immediately took to the skies and flew away. If birds evolved to not fly because they didn't need to, they wouldn't suddenly start flying again just because they were introduced to a new species. But since the birds of Stewart Island are actually worse at flying, they took this as a cue to try and get better at flying. And that's why they flew away. So yeah, it turns out that sometimes evolution can take things away from living things, even if it's something that seems immediately beneficial.